I woke up to the sound of water slapping metal, slow and hollow, like something knocking from the inside of my chest. For a moment, I thought I was dreaming. Then the smell hit me, salt fuel heat. I wasn't in a bed. I wasn't anywhere with walls. I was on a small fishing boat drifting in open water, the horizon flat and endless in every direction. My daughter was beside me, 11 years old, her skin too warm, her lips dry. The sea around us was empty, no radio crackle, no engine hum, no land in sight. The backup gear was gone, the safety equipment missing. And under a loose rock near the bow, a single sheet of paper waited like it had been placed there carefully. 2 words. You chose this. That was when I understood. This wasn't an accident. It wasn't a mistake. Someone had decided that if we disappeared out here, the ocean would do the rest. And if we survived, they'd make sure we never spoke. Before I tell you who was standing there and what happened next, take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if this story resonates with you. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. I truly enjoy connecting with you. Now let me take you back to where everything began. The heat came first. Not all at once, but in layers pressing through my eyelids, down my throat, into the joints of my fingers. It was the kind of heat that didn't announce itself. It settled. When I finally opened my eyes, the light was so sharp, it felt physical, like it could bruise if I moved too quickly. For a second, I didn't understand where I was. Then the boat rocked gently beneath me, and the smell of salt snapped everything into place. I sat up too fast. The horizon tilted. My stomach lurched, but instinct cut through the dizziness before panic could reach it. I turned immediately to my right. Sloane was there, curled on her side, her life vest still buckled. Her cheek pressed against the metal bench. Her breathing was shallow but steady. That was the first thing I checked. Always the first thing. Her pulse was there. Slower than normal, but there. I exhaled through my nose and kept my hand still, forcing myself not to shake her awake. The ocean around us was unnervingly calm, not peaceful, just indifferent. No whitecaps, no gulls, no distant silhouettes of boats cutting the water. Just blue layered on blue, broken only by the low outline of our own vessel. A small fishing boat? Aluminum hull? Scratches along the side that suggested it had lived a harder life than the rental brochures promised. We were drifting, not anchored, not idling. Just moving slow and steady, carried by something I couldn't see. I took inventory the way I'd been trained to do years ago, back when my job involved untangling other people's messes for a living. Facts first, emotion later. Emotions. 2 plastic water bottles sat near the stern, both partially full. 1 energy bar already soft from the heat. A first aid kit stripped down to bandages and antiseptic wipes. No blade, no scissors. A backpack I didn't recognize tucked under the bench, too clean, too intentionally packed. A thermos near my feet, its lid screwed on tight. And no radio. I leaned forward, my head pounding now, and checked the console. The ignition slot was empty, not broken, not jammed, just empty. The GPS mount was there, the plastic cradle still screwed into place, but the device itself was gone. I opened the compartment where emergency gear should have been stored. Nothing. No flares, no whistle, no signal mirror. Even the spare battery pack was missing. Whoever had prepared this boat hadn't rushed. They'd known exactly what to take and what to leave behind to make this look survivable, but barely. That was when I noticed the paper. It was pinned under a smooth, deliberate stone near the bow, placed just far enough from Sloane that she wouldn't have seen it when she woke up. I didn't touch it right away. I stared at it the way you stare at something that feels like it might rearrange your insides if you acknowledge it too quickly. Then I lifted the rock and unfolded the page. You chose this. No signature, no explanation. Just those 2 words centered and clean printed in a font I recognized even before I admitted it to myself. My sister's printer. The one she always bragged about because it never jammed and saved money on ink. I could hear her voice in my head, as clearly as if she were standing behind me, tone calm, sharp, precise. You chose this, as if that absolved everything that followed. I folded the paper carefully, smoothing the creases, instead of crumpling it the way my body wanted to. Evidence. I slid it into the inner lining of the backpack, tucked behind a seam where it wouldn't get wet or fall out. I had learned the hard way that details mattered most when the people who hurt you were counting on your memory to fail. The thermos caught my attention again. I unscrewed the lid just enough to smell it. Chamomile, maybe. Lavender. But there was something heavier beneath it. Something medicinal. My mouth tasted metallic, like I'd bitten my tongue hours ago, and the flavor had never left. I didn't drink it. I didn't dump it either. I screwed the lid back on and set it aside. Another fact, another piece. I looked at Sloane again. Her eyelashes fluttered, and she shifted slightly, a soft sound leaving her throat. Relief hit me so hard, it almost knocked me forward. I reached out and brushed the hair back from her face, then pulled my hand away before she could wake up. I needed her calm. If I unraveled now, she would feel it. The realization didn't come all at once. It assembled itself slowly, like a structure locking into place. This wasn't a misunderstanding. No one had forgotten us. No one was circling back once they realized we weren't on board. The equipment had been removed deliberately. The note had been placed deliberately. The timing, late morning when the sun was already high and the sea traffic thinner, had been chosen deliberately. I scanned the horizon again, this time with intent. No shipping lanes close enough to flag. No visible coastline. The swell beneath us was subtle but consistent, pulling us in one direction, away from where we'd started, away from help. I checked my phone out of habit, even though I already knew what I'd see. No signal, no service. The ocean had swallowed the bars completely. Sloane stirred again and opened her eyes. "Dad," her voice was small, uncertain. "I'm here," I said immediately, keeping my tone level. "You're okay?" She squinted against the light. "Where's everyone else?" I paused, not long enough for her to panic, but long enough to choose my words. "They went ahead," I said. "We're just waiting a bit." She nodded slowly, accepting that answer the way children do when they trust the ground beneath them. I handed her the water bottle and watched carefully as she took a sip. "Just a little," I said. "We have to make it last." She didn't argue. That scared me more than if she had. As she leaned back against the bench, I sat there with my back straight and my eyes open, measuring the sun's position, the drift of the boat, the weight of what had been done to us. Somewhere out there, the people who were supposed to protect us were already planning their next move. And I understood with a clarity that felt almost cold that if we didn't make it back, this would all be written off as an unfortunate accident at sea. I wasn't going to let that happen. Not to me. Not to her. Time behaved differently out there. Minutes stretched until they lost their edges and then collapsed back in on themselves without warning. The sun climbed higher, and with it came a kind of pressure that didn't feel external. It settled into my shoulders, my neck, the small space behind my eyes, where decisions are made. I shifted my position slightly to keep Sloane in the narrow strip of shade cast by the console, angling my body, so my back took the worst of it. Salt crusted along my forearms. Every movement felt deliberate, rationed. I watched the water. Not the surface that would have been hypnotic, but the direction of our drift, and the way the boat's nose corrected itself with each slow swell. We were being pulled, not pushed. A current with patience. It didn't care how small we were. It didn't care how long it took. I made rules quietly inside my head, because saying them out loud felt like inviting fear to listen. We would drink on schedule, not when we felt thirsty. We would stay seated. We would not panic. Panic wastes water. Panic wastes energy. Panic tells children that the world is about to break. Sloane leaned against me, her head resting just under my collarbone. I could feel the heat through her life vest, the way her breathing deepened and then shallowed again. She wasn't fully asleep, not really. More like hovering somewhere between where the body gives up control, but the mind hasn't decided what to do yet. "How long are we waiting?" she asked after a while. "Until someone comes by," I said. "The ocean's busy. It just doesn't look like it." She nodded again. That trust, unearned absolute, landed heavier than anything else. I tightened my arm around her and stared out at the empty horizon, knowing that what I was telling her was only half true. I pulled the backpack closer and checked its contents more thoroughly. A spare shirt neatly folded. Sunscreen travel-sized. A laminated rental agreement with our names typed correctly, like someone had taken care to avoid mistakes. No phone charger, no knife, no emergency beacon. Everything that might keep us alive had been measured against everything that might get us rescued. And rescue, I understood now, had never been the point. The thermos sat between my feet, accusing. I picked it up again this time, opening it fully. The liquid inside was pale, almost cloudy, with a faint sheen that caught the light. I dipped a finger in and rubbed it between my thumb and forefinger. Too slick, too deliberate. I wiped my hand on my shorts and screwed the lid back on a heart steady but hard. Someone had calculated dosage. Someone had thought about my weight, Sloane's age. Someone had decided sedation was safer than force. I thought about the morning before the boat ride. The way my sister had pressed the thermos into my hands with that practiced smile, the way she'd said my name like a suggestion. I thought about my mother standing a little too far back, her eyes fixed on the floor. I thought about the silence that followed when I said I wasn't signing anything yet. The phrase from the note returned quiet and sharp. "You chose this." I pressed my tongue to the roof of my mouth until the bitterness faded. No, I hadn't chosen this. They had chosen convenience. They had chosen leverage. They had chosen a version of the world where the ocean erased problems more cleanly than paperwork ever could. A shadow moved far off to the east. My heart jumped before my brain caught up. I squinted, shielding my eyes. For a few seconds, it looked like a ship's outline, tall, dark, purposeful. I stood slowly, keeping my balance, and raised my arms, waving both hands overhead. The shape grew, then thinned, then vanished as the swell shifted. It had been nothing. Or worse, it had been something too far away to notice us. The difference didn't matter. The result was the same. I sat back down and forced my breathing to slow. Sloane watched me carefully, her eyes searching my face for clues I didn't want to give her. "Did you see something?" she asked. "Just clouds," I said. "They play tricks on you out here." She accepted that too, though her fingers tightened in the strap of her vest. I gave her another sip of water, then capped the bottle and tucked it away. I could feel my own thirst blooming now, a dryness that started in the throat and spread upward. I ignored it. Children first, always. I needed a plan that didn't rely on hope. I took out a receipt from my wallet and flattened it against my knee, shielding it from the wind. On the back, I wrote, carefully pressing hard so the ink wouldn't fade, my name, the date, Sloane's age, and the fact that we had been left adrift, the items missing from the boat. I wrote where we had launched from and the direction of the current as best I could judge it. I folded the paper and wedged it under an empty bottle, anchoring it in the shallow storage compartment near the bow. If someone found the boat without us, I wanted the story to be there waiting. Sloane watched me do it. "What's that for, just in case?" I said. "Grown-up stuff." She nodded, then surprised me by saying, "You're not going to leave me, right?" The question landed without warning, soft and devastating. I crouched in front of her, bringing my face level with hers, and took her hands in mine. "No," I said without hesitation. "I'm not going anywhere without you." She studied my face for a long moment, then leaned forward and pressed her forehead against my chest. "Okay." I looked at the water again, this time with a different kind of focus. Somewhere ahead of us, there had to be markers, buoys, shipping routes, signs of human passage. The current was steady. If I timed it right, if I conserved enough strength, I could swim. Not far, not heroically, just far enough to intersect something solid. The idea terrified me. The water wasn't cold, but it was vast. It would sap my energy without asking permission. And leaving Sloane alone on the boat, even for a short time, felt like tearing something vital out of my chest. But the alternative, waiting until the sun did what it was designed to do, wasn't an option. I laid out instructions for her in a voice that didn't shake. "Stay seated. Stay shaded. Don't put your hands in the water. Wave only if you see a boat close enough to hear you. Never jump in after me." She repeated each rule back, serious, precise, like she understood the weight of what we were doing. When I stood at the edge of the boat, the sea looked different. Not endless now, just dangerous. I took one last look at her face, memorizing the curve of her cheek, the freckle near her ear, the way she held herself so still. "I'm going to get help," I said. "And I'm coming back." "I know," she said. The water closed around me with a shock that stole my breath anyway. It was heavier than it looked, resistant. I let myself float for a moment, then began to swim steady and unremarkable, counting strokes instead of distance. I didn't look back more than once. The second time might have broken something I needed intact. Behind me, the boat grew smaller. Ahead of me, the ocean waited indifferent as ever. But beneath the fear, beneath the exhaustion already creeping into my limbs, there was something else, quiet and immovable. I wasn't going to disappear. I don't know how long I swam before the shape appeared. Time dissolved into repetition, reach, pull, breathe, each movement measured against the next. The sun pressed down on the back of my neck, and the salt stung my eyes until everything blurred at the edges. I kept my head up just enough to sight ahead, scanning for anything that didn't belong to the water. Anything solid. Anything human. My arms began to feel distant, like they belonged to someone else. That was when I saw it, a buoy. Not close, not generous, but real. A faded orange marker bobbing in the swell, scarred with rust and bird droppings, anchored to something unseen beneath the surface. I adjusted my angle toward it, letting the current do some of the work. When I reached it, my fingers closed around the metal ring, and I hung there, chest heaving, forehead pressed to the cool iron, like it might steady my thoughts. I climbed just enough to rest my elbows on the rim and looked back. The boat was still there, smaller now, but unmistakable. A speck against the water, drifting exactly the way it had before. Sloane was seated where I'd left her. Even from that distance, I could tell she hadn't moved. The relief hit me so hard, my vision darkened for a second. I forced myself to breathe slowly to keep the world from tipping. A sound carried over the water, then low, uneven, unmistakable. An engine, not the steady roar of something large, but the laboring hum of a working boat. I turned toward it, heart pounding, and raised one arm. I didn't shout. My throat was too dry, and I knew better than to waste what little strength I had left. I waved instead, broad and deliberate. The boat came into view, gradually cresting the swell at an angle that suggested it knew these waters well. A fishing vessel, weathered, functional, the kind of boat that didn't belong to tourists. As it drew closer, a man leaned over the rail, squinting against the sun. He cut the engine and let momentum carry him in. "You all right?" He called out, voice rough but steady. "My daughter," I said, the words tearing out of me. "On the boat behind me. We need help." He didn't ask questions. He tossed me a line and hauled me in with a strength that surprised me, then swung the bow around without another word. As we approached the drifting boat, he slowed, careful not to rock it too hard. Sloane looked up when she heard his voice, her face crumpling with a relief she'd been holding back for hours. "Hey there," he said, gently kneeling to her level as he helped her across. "You did good, kid." She nodded, silent, and clung to his jacket, as if it were the only real thing left in the world. His name was Jonah Reed, a local fisherman who'd been working these waters longer than he could remember. He wrapped Sloane in a dry jacket, handed her water, then turned his attention back to me. "You're lucky," he said quietly, not unkindly. "Current's been pulling hard today. Another couple hours and you'd have been well past the lanes." Luck wasn't the word I would have chosen, but I nodded anyway. He radioed the Coast Guard as he steered us toward shore, his voice calm and precise, using terminology I didn't recognize, but trusted. As the adrenaline drained out of me, the shaking set in. My muscles cramped, my teeth chattered, and the edges of my vision pulsed. I kept my eyes on Sloane, counting her breaths, reminding myself she was here, she was alive. At the dock, uniformed officers met us with practiced efficiency. Blankets, stretchers, questions delivered gently but firmly. A woman introduced herself as a Marine Deputy, Caleb Moreno, her tone professional, her eyes sharp. She listened as Jonah explained where he'd found us, nodding slowly, already cataloging the implications. In the clinic under lights that buzzed softly overhead, everything smelled like antiseptic and salt. Sloane lay on a cot across from mine, her small body wrapped in blankets, cheeks flushed from sunburn. I watched her chest rise and fall over and over, grounding myself in that simple motion. When the nurse asked if we consented to toxicology screens, I said yes without hesitation. The results came back faster than I expected. Benzodiazepine derivatives, in both of us. Clearly ingested, clearly not accidental. I stared at the printout while something inside me went very still. It wasn't shock, it was recognition. The confirmation of a truth I'd already accepted somewhere out on the water. They hadn't just endangered us. They had planned for us to be incapacitated. Quiet, manageable. Deputy Moreno returned later with updates. The boat had been secured, the thermos bagged, fingerprints lifted, the missing safety equipment noted. She spoke in facts, but her jaw tightened when she mentioned one detail in particular. "Your family contacted legal counsel within hours," she said, "before they contacted us, before any missing persons report." I closed my eyes briefly. "They weren't worried we were lost," I said. "They were worried we'd come back." The next days blurred together in a haze of forms and statements and careful documentation. I spoke to detectives. I called a lawyer recommended by the clinic's social worker, Elliot Park, who listened without interruption and told me very plainly that I needed to prepare for a fight on multiple fronts. "You survived the incident," he said. "That's only the first step." He was right. We were home 3 days later. The house felt smaller than I remembered, the walls closer, the air heavier. Sloane moved through it cautiously, flinching at sudden noises, asking me to check the locks more than once each night. I made pancakes. I packed lunches. I did everything I could to make the world feel predictable again. But predictability was already gone. The first filing arrived less than a week later. An emergency motion framed in soft language about concern and stability. Questions about my mental health, about my capacity to parent alone after loss. It was an attempt to rewrite the story before the ink on the truth had dried. I sat at the kitchen table long after Sloan fell asleep, documents spread out in front of me, the house quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator. I thought about the ocean, about how easily it could have swallowed us, and about how close they'd come to letting it. This wasn't over. Not even close. The filing didn't accuse me outright. It didn't need to. It was written in the language of concern, the kind that sounds reasonable, until you sit with it long enough to feel the blade hidden inside the phrasing. Words like impulsive, emotionally compromised, recent bereavement. Suggestions that my judgment might be clouded, that my grief could be dangerous, that Sloan's best interests required temporary evaluation. Temporary was doing a lot of work there. Elliot called me as soon as he received the notice. They're not trying to win on facts, he said. They're trying to win on timing. He explained it patiently, even though I already understood the shape of it. If they could destabilize me in family court, raise doubt, slow things down, force evaluations, they could create space. Space to negotiate. Space to pressure. Space to make me tired enough to sign something I shouldn't. The land. The trust. Control disguised as care. I told him about the ocean, about the note, about the thermos. I heard the shift in his voice, then subtle but unmistakable. We're going to document everything he said, and we're going to do it faster than they expect. The days that followed became procedural. I requested copies of the clinic records, the toxicology reports, the Coast Guard incident summary. I wrote my statement again slower this time, making sure each detail stayed exactly where it belonged. I asked Deputy Moreno to confirm the chain of custody on the thermos and the note. She did her tone clipped and professional, but there was something else there too, recognition maybe, the look of someone who had seen this pattern before and didn't like how familiar it felt. Sloan started therapy that week. A quiet office with soft lighting and shelves of toys that looked more symbolic than inviting. She didn't say much at first. She colored. She stacked blocks. She answered questions with nods and shrugs. But when the therapist asked her about the boat, Sloan froze her crayon, hovering midair. My mom told me not to talk about the tea, she said finally, her voice flat. I felt the room tilt. The therapist's pen paused. She didn't push. She wrote it down and changed the subject. Later in the hallway, she met my eyes and nodded once. Not a promise. Just acknowledgement. That night I didn't sleep. I sat at the table again, the same documents spread out, the same lamp, casting a narrow pool of light. I thought about my sister's kitchen, the way she lined things up just so. The way she spoke about planning as if it were a virtue instead of a weapon. I thought about my parents' silence, their calm, their certainty that this would resolve itself if they waited long enough. They hadn't counted on Sloan saying anything out loud. Deputy Moreno called the next morning. We've pulled the marina logs, she said. Rental times, return times, staff statements. She let that sit for a moment before continuing. Your family didn't report you missing. At all. Not to the marina. Not to us. They returned their boats, thanked the staff, and left. How long, I asked. Several hours before we were notified, she said. And when we asked the dock attendant if anything seemed off, he said they were calm. Joked about the weather. I pictured it easily. My sister laughing lightly, my father nodding, my mother standing a half step behind them. All of it rehearsed. All of it meant to look normal. Elliot filed our response that afternoon. It was blunt. Toxicology results attached. Rescue reports included. Photographs of the stripped boat. A request that any evaluation of my mental health be conducted by a court-appointed professional, not one selected by opposing counsel. We asked for Sloane's records to be sealed. We asked for a guardian ad litem to be appointed, not because I needed oversight, but because she did. The shift was immediate. The emails from my family's attorney stopped being warm. The phone calls stopped entirely. Silence settled in thick and expectant. It was the quiet that comes before a storm changes direction. Then Jonah Reed called. "I've been thinking about you folks," he said. "About where I found you." He told me he'd gone back out the next day curious, following the same stretch of water. The current, he said, was unusual but predictable. Strong enough to carry a small boat away from the main routes without drawing attention. "Someone who knows these waters could guess where you'd end up," he said. Not exact, but close. I thanked him and wrote everything down. The deleted message surfaced 2 days later. A partial recovery from my sister's phone backup flagged during a routine sweep. Just a line. "Once he signs, it's over. Tomorrow it's done." Timestamped the night before the boat trip. Motive, planning, timeline. Elliot read it once and nodded. "That changes things," he said. The investigation escalated. What had been a civil concern edged toward criminal territory. Endangerment, conspiracy, unlawful administration of a controlled substance. Words that carried weight. Words my family hadn't expected to hear applied to themselves. The court date arrived in a thick envelope, the paper heavier than it needed to be. An emergency custody hearing requested by my sister framed as a protective measure. I read it 3 times, then folded it carefully and placed it with the others. That night, Sloane fell asleep on the couch, her head in my lap, a cartoon murmuring in the background. I stroked her hair and watched her chest rise and fall the same way I had in the clinic, the same way I had on the boat. The repetition was grounding. Proof that we were still here. I knew what the hearing would look like. I knew how they would dress it up, soften the edges, make me sound volatile without ever raising their voices. They would count on my restraint, on my reluctance to make a scene. They would expect me to break under the weight of it. They were wrong. I didn't need to be loud. I needed to be precise. And this time, I wasn't standing alone. The courthouse smelled like paper and old air, the kind that settles into fabric and never quite leaves. Everything inside it felt designed to flatten emotion, straight-backed chairs, pale walls, fluorescent lights that hummed just loudly enough to remind you where you were. I arrived early, Sloane's hand wrapped in mine, her grip tighter than usual. Elliot met us near the entrance, calm as ever, a thin folder tucked under his arm. "They're already here," he said quietly, nodding toward the far end of the hall. I didn't look right away. I didn't need to. I could feel them the way you feel a change in pressure before a storm. When I finally did turn, they were exactly where I expected them to be. My sister stood beside her attorney, dressed in soft gray hair, pulled back expression carefully neutral. My parents sat a few chairs away, hands folded, faces composed. If someone didn't know better, they might have thought this was a family waiting for good news. Sloane shifted closer to me. I bent slightly and whispered, "Remember what we talked about?" She nodded. "I don't talk unless you're there." That's right. The hearing room was smaller than I expected. Intimate in a way that made everything feel sharper. The judge entered without ceremony, took his seat, and glanced down at the file in front of him. My sister's attorney began his voice smooth-measured, threaded with concern. He spoke about loss, about instability, about the pressures of single parenthood and the risks it posed when grief went unaddressed. He never once mentioned the ocean. When it was his turn, Elliot stood. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't dramatize. He laid the facts out like stones, one after another, until there was no space left to stand on anything else. Toxicology reports, rescue timelines, photographs of the boat, the note, the fingerprints. He spoke about intent without ever using the word, letting the evidence do the work instead. Then he did something I hadn't expected. "We are not opposing oversight," he said. "We are requesting it." There was a pause. My sister's attorney blinked. "We asked the court to appoint a guardian ad litem." Elliot continued to assess Sloane's well-being independently. "And my client is willing to submit to a full psychological evaluation conducted by a court-appointed professional." The room shifted. I felt it. The quiet recalibration of expectations. They hadn't planned for cooperation. They had planned for resistance. The judge nodded slowly, his gaze moving from Elliot to me. "You understand," he said, "that this process can be invasive." "I do," I said. My voice didn't waver. "I want it on the record." The guardian ad litem was appointed that day, not to remove Sloane from my care, but to observe, to listen, to protect her interests, not anyone else's agenda. My sister's motion for immediate separation was denied pending further review. It wasn't a victory. It was a line drawn. Outside, my parents avoided my eyes. My sister held her expression until the doors closed behind us, then let it crack just enough for me to see the anger beneath. Not fear, not regret. Anger that the plan had slipped. The criminal investigation moved faster after that. Deputy Moreno called me the following afternoon. "We've matched the printer," she said. "The note came from the same model your sister uses in her home office. Same firmware, same ink pattern, and the thermos," I asked. "Fingerprints," she said. "Yours, your daughter's, and both of theirs. No gloves, no plausible explanation." I sat at the table and let the chair creak beneath me. Sloane was at school. The house was quiet. The truth once again was louder than anything else. The guardian ad litem visited the next week. Her name was Elaine Porter, mid-40s, practical, unadorned. She spoke to Sloane alone first, then to me, then observed us together. She didn't pry. She watched how Sloane responded when I corrected her, how I responded when she hesitated, how we moved around each other in the kitchen, in the living room, in the quiet spaces where children reveal more than they mean to. When Elaine left, she shook my hand. "I'll submit my report," she said. "Soon." I didn't ask what it would say. I already knew what she'd seen. The indictment came 2 days later. Criminal conspiracy, child endangerment, unlawful administration of a controlled substance. The words sat on the page with a weight that made my chest tighten. I read them once, then again, then folded the document and placed it with the others. Elliot called to walk me through it, his voice steady, professional. "This doesn't end everything," he said, "but it changes the ground." My sister was arrested that evening, Troy with her. My parents were questioned separately. I learned later that my mother had asked for her own attorney halfway through the interview, that my father had gone quiet, answering only what he was asked, nothing more. Sloane came home from school and found me at the table. She looked at my face and stopped short. "Did something happen?" "Yes," I said, choosing honesty over comfort. "But we're safe." She studied me for a long moment and climbed into my lap like she used to when she was smaller, her arms wrapping around my neck. I held her and let myself breathe. The trial didn't happen all at once. It unfolded in segments, hearings and motions and testimony that blurred together until the details felt unreal. Sloane didn't attend. That was non-negotiable. If she spoke, it would be through closed session protected. But she didn't need to. Others spoke for her. Jonah testified via video describing the current, the location, the timing. The Coast Guard presented their findings. Deputy Moreno walked through the evidence with the precision of someone who knew exactly how much was at stake. The recovered message was entered into record. The printer match, the toxicology. And then my mother testified. She cried, not theatrically, quietly. She admitted she knew the tea had something in it, that it was meant to scare me, to push me toward reason. She said she never thought it would go that far, that they didn't mean to hurt Sloan. Intent doesn't disappear just because regret shows up late. The verdict came on a gray morning that felt ordinary enough to be cruel. Guilty, on all counts for my sister, Troy as an accomplice. My parents avoided prison by cooperating fully. Their sentences suspended under strict probation and a permanent restriction on unsupervised contact with Sloan. Afterward, I didn't feel relief. I felt tired. The land was placed into an irrevocable trust under Sloan's name, locked until she turned 25. Untouchable, unusable by anyone else. I severed every remaining financial tie, closed shared accounts, changed beneficiaries, updated legal contacts. We moved a few months later. Not far. Just enough. Some nights Sloan still asked me to check the doors. Some mornings she asked if the ocean was close. I answered every question the same way. We're safe. And this time it wasn't a promise. It was a fact. After the verdict, the noise didn't stop all at once. It thinned. Conversations shifted from urgent to procedural. Phone calls turned shorter. Emails lost their edge. The world didn't reset itself just because a judge had spoken. It reorganized slowly around what had been decided. Elaine Porter's final report arrived a week later. It was clinical in the way only careful documents can be: observations, interactions, patterns. She wrote about Sloan's vigilance, about the way she checked my face before answering questions, about how her shoulders relaxed when she realized I was in the room. She wrote about me too, about consistency, about restraint, about a parent who didn't overcorrect or perform grief, who stayed present even when it would have been easier to disappear into anger. The court adopted her recommendations in full. Supervised contact only, and only if Sloan wanted it. No surprise visits. No calls routed through relatives. No attempts to frame reconciliation as obligation. The boundaries were written in plain language, enforceable, unmistakable. My parents didn't contest them. That was the part that surprised me most. Not because I expected remorse, but because I expected resistance. Instead, there was a quiet acceptance that felt less like accountability and more like retreat. They had exhausted their leverage. Without it, there was nothing left to argue. My sister didn't reach out at all. The house we moved into was smaller than the one we left. Older. It had creaky floors and a yard that needed more care than I had time to give it. But it was ours in a way the other place never had been. No shared history embedded in the walls. No expectation of who we were supposed to be when we crossed the threshold. The first night there, Sloan walked from room to room, touching the door frames, opening closets, checking windows. She did it quietly, methodically. When she finished, she climbed onto the couch beside me and rested her head against my arm. "Are we staying here?" she asked. "Yes," I said. "As long as you want." She nodded, satisfied, and fell asleep with her shoes still on. Life didn't become peaceful immediately. It became manageable. There's a difference. Peace implies forgetting. We weren't there yet. Manageable meant routines, school drop-offs, therapy appointments, dinners eaten at the table instead of in front of a screen. It meant answering the same questions over and over until the answers stopped shaking. Sometimes Sloan asked about the ocean. Not directly, not the way adults would. She asked if boats ever got lost, if currents could change direction without warning, if people knew before they went out what might happen to them. I answered honestly without embellishment. Sometimes, I said, and sometimes people think they know more than they do. She thought about that, then went back to her homework. I didn't tell her everything. Not yet. She didn't need the full shape of it. She needed stability, not explanation. The truth would still be there when she was ready for it. Elliot checked in periodically, less as my attorney and more as a witness to closure. He confirmed the trust was finalized, the land untouchable. He told me the remaining appeals window had passed, that what was done was for all practical purposes done. Most people think the end of a case feels dramatic, he said once. It rarely does. He was right. The end felt quiet, like a door closing somewhere in the distance, not slammed, just shut. I returned to work, gradually taking on projects that didn't require late nights or constant availability. The spreadsheets balanced again. The rhythm returned. Not the same rhythm as before, nothing ever is, but one I could move within without thinking about escape routes. There were moments when anger rose up unexpectedly. At the grocery store, in traffic, while folding laundry. It never stayed long. It burned too hot to hold. What remained was something colder and more useful clarity. I knew now how easily people could confuse entitlement with love, how quickly concern could be weaponized, how silence, when it benefits the powerful, is praised as maturity. I also knew what it cost to refuse that script. One afternoon, months later, Jonah Reed stopped by. He'd been in the area, he said, and thought he'd check in. He stood in the doorway, hat in hand, eyes, taking in the house without judgment. "You look steadier," he said. "So do you?" I replied, though I had no idea if it was true. He stayed for coffee. We talked about the weather, about fishing, about nothing in particular. When he left, he paused at the steps. "You did right by her," he said. Not as praise, as fact. That mattered more than he probably realized. Sloane's nightmares faded gradually. Not gone entirely, but softer, less frequent. She started leaving her door open at night instead of asking me to sit beside her until she slept. She made a friend at school who lived down the street. She laughed more easily. The sound startled me at first, like I'd forgotten what it was supposed to feel like. On the anniversary of the incident, I took the day off work. We didn't talk about it. We went to a park instead, ate sandwiches, watched dogs chase tennis balls. Ordinary things. When the sun started to dip, Sloane reached for my hand. "Can we go home now?" she asked. Anytime I said. That was when I realized what survival had actually given us. Not a story. Not vindication. Space. Space to choose what came next, without someone else trying to decide for us. I didn't reconnect with my family. There were no tearful apologies, no attempts at reconciliation dressed up as healing. What contact existed stayed within the lines drawn by the court and by me. I didn't hate them. Hate requires engagement. I didn't have that to spare. What I had was a child who trusted me to keep her safe. That trust wasn't loud. It didn't announce itself. It showed up in small ways. In the way she left her backpack by the door without checking if it would be moved. In the way she slept through the night without asking for reassurance. In the way she looked at me when something scared her, not for rescue, but for confirmation that fear didn't get to decide. Some people call that winning. I don't. Winning suggests a contest. This wasn't that. This was choosing not to let someone else rewrite our ending. Choosing truth over convenience. Choosing protection over peacekeeping. The ocean didn't take us, and neither did they. The quiet that followed wasn't empty. It was watchful. Even after the court orders settled into place and the headlines faded, if they'd ever existed at all, I moved through each day with a measured awareness, like someone who had learned the cost of assuming safety. I didn't check the doors because I was afraid they'd come back. I checked them because habit is a form of memory, and memory doesn't disappear just because danger retreats. Elaine Porter returned once more months later, not as an observer, but as a courtesy. She wanted to see how Sloane was doing without the weight of proceedings pressing down on her. They sat at the kitchen table drawing, talking about school, about a book Sloane had started reading and abandoned halfway through because it felt too sad. Elaine listened more than she spoke. When she left, she smiled at Sloane and said, "You're doing exactly what you're supposed to be doing." After the door closed, Sloane looked at me. "What am I supposed to be doing?" "Growing," I said, "at your pace." She considered that, then went back to her room, the question already answered in her own way. I kept thinking the adrenaline would wear off completely, that one morning I'd wake up, and the memory of the sea would feel distant, like something that happened to another version of me. It didn't. What changed was the way it surfaced. No longer as fear, but as calibration, a constant quiet reference point. When something felt off, I listened. When someone pressed too hard, I stepped back. When a decision needed to be made, I asked myself one question: does this protect what matters, or does it just preserve appearances? The answer was almost always clear. The criminal case moved through its final stages without requiring anything further from me. Sentencing was handled, conditions set. I received updates through Elliot, filtered and factual. I didn't attend. I didn't need to see faces or hear explanations. Closure, I learned, isn't a ceremony. It's a boundary you stop negotiating. Sloane asked about her grandparents once late at night when the house was quiet and the air felt heavy with questions. "Are they mad at us?" she asked. "No," I said after a moment. "They made choices, and now there are rules." She nodded, absorbing that in the way children do, without moralizing it, without needing villains. Just cause and effect. "And my aunt?" she asked. I didn't answer right away. I chose my words carefully. "She's not safe for us to be around." "Okay," Sloane said. No follow-up, no argument, just acceptance. Trust again offered without conditions. At school, the counselor reported steady progress, fewer startle responses, better sleep. Sloane began volunteering answers in class again. She signed up for a science club, came home excited about experiments that failed as often as they worked. Failure, I noticed, no longer scared her. It was just information, something to examine, not escape. In that, she reminded me of myself. One afternoon, while cleaning out a box in the garage, I found the life vest. The same one Sloane had worn on the boat. It still smelled faintly of salt and sun. I held it for a long time, fingers tracing the worn seams, the scuffed buckles. I considered throwing it away, starting clean. Instead, I stored it carefully sealed in plastic, labeled and dated like everything else that had once mattered, because it might need to be proven. Some objects don't deserve to be forgotten. They deserve to be contextualized. I ran into Deputy Moreno by chance at a grocery store weeks later. We recognized each other at the same time and shared a look that held more history than the setting deserved. She asked how Sloane was doing. I told her the truth. She nodded, satisfied. "You handled it well," she said. "A lot of people don't." "I didn't know there was a right way," I said. "There isn't," she replied. "Just a way that keeps the damage from spreading." That stayed with me. As summer edged toward fall, the air cooled and the days shortened. We developed rituals that had nothing to do with recovery and everything to do with living. Saturday pancakes, evening walks. A rule that homework ended at dinner, no exceptions. We planted a small tree in the yard, not to mark anything, just because Sloane wanted something that would grow slower than she did. One evening, as we watered it together, she asked, "Do you think the ocean remembers us?" I smiled, surprised by the question. "No," I said. "The ocean doesn't remember. It just moves." She seemed to like that answer. I thought about the people who had tried to use that movement to erase us, how they'd counted on distance and silence and plausible deniability, how they'd believed that the sea would do what they couldn't say out loud. They had underestimated something fundamental, not my strength or even my resolve, but my refusal to disappear quietly. There's a particular kind of loneliness that comes from standing up to your own family. It doesn't announce itself. It shows up in small absences. Holidays that pass without invitations, old traditions that no longer fit. I felt it sometimes, usually in passing, like a shadow crossing a wall. I didn't chase it away. I acknowledged it and let it go. Loneliness is lighter than fear. On a clear afternoon, months after everything had settled, Sloane and I stood at the edge of a pier watching boats come and go. We hadn't planned to be there. It was a detour, nothing more. She leaned against the railing, hair pulled back by the breeze, face calm. "Are we going out there?" she asked, nodding toward the water. "Not today," I said. She considered that, then smiled. "Maybe another time." Maybe I agreed. The difference mattered. Choice, agency. The understanding that nothing would happen to us without our consent, not anymore. I don't tell this story because it's extraordinary. I tell it because it isn't. Because the most dangerous things are often done quietly under the guise of care, by people who assume they'll never be challenged. Because survival isn't always dramatic. Sometimes it's just the long work of paying attention and refusing to be rushed. We weren't saved by luck. We were saved by noticing what didn't add up and by acting before silence could settle in and harden into truth. The sea is still out there, vast, indifferent, unchanged. So are we. The next phase didn't announce itself with urgency. It crept in through ordinary channels, certified mail calendar reminders, polite emails that asked for availability. It was the phase where consequences finished forming, where systems that had been set in motion finally met the people who thought they could outrun them. The family court review came first. Not a hearing this time, but a status conference. Short. Procedural. The judge referenced Elaine Porter's report, the criminal docket, the compliance logs. There was no argument left to make. The restrictions remained in place, formalized now into something that didn't need my vigilance to hold. When the call ended, I sat there with my laptop open and felt something like weight lifting, not relief exactly, but a loosening. A recognition that the ground beneath us had finally stopped shifting. The criminal side moved differently, slower, heavier. I wasn't required to testify again, but I was asked to review transcripts to verify details that would be entered into record permanently. I read my mother's deposition in one sitting, hands flat on the table, eyes moving steadily across words that felt both familiar and alien. She spoke about fear, about pressure, about wanting to keep the family together. She never once used the word choice. My sister's statements were different, tighter, legal, framed around misunderstanding and escalation. She acknowledged the tea but denied intent to harm, denied the note was meant as threat, denied knowledge of the current, denied until the evidence forced her into narrower and narrower corners. What remained wasn't innocence. It was calculation. I didn't respond to any of it. My role in that part was finished. I'd learned that silence, when chosen freely, can be a form of integrity. Sloane felt the shift before I did. Children always do. One morning as I packed her lunch, she said, "It feels quieter lately." I smiled. That's because it is. She nodded, satisfied, and went back to telling me about a project she was working on at school. The ease in her voice startled me. Not because I'd forgotten it, but because I'd learned not to expect it. Therapy sessions tapered off, not ended, just spaced out. The therapist explained it as consolidation. Sloane had processed what she needed to process. Now she was building. That word stayed with me. Building. It suggested a future that wasn't oriented around what we'd escaped. I noticed changes in myself too. Small ones. I stopped rehearsing explanations in my head before phone calls. I stopped scanning rooms for exits. When a decision came up about work, about money, about where to spend a weekend, I no longer measured it against hypothetical backlash. I measured it against one thing: did it keep our lives intact? Elliot called once more with a final update. Appeals window closed, he said. No further motions expected. Thank you, I said, and meant more than the words could carry. You did the hard part, he replied. You didn't blink. After that, the call stopped, not abruptly, naturally, like a role that had reached its conclusion. The land trust paperwork arrived last. Thick, precise, the kind of document that makes its own authority clear without raising its voice. I signed where required, notarized where instructed, and placed it in the safe alongside the rest. Sloane's name sat at the top, spelled correctly, no asterisks, no contingencies. I ran my finger over it once before closing the folder. It wasn't a trophy. It was insulation, something that would hold even if everything else failed. We celebrated nothing. No dinner out, no cake, just a normal evening, homework, dishes, a show we'd already seen but liked enough to watch again. When Sloane went to bed, she didn't ask me to leave the light on. She didn't ask me to check the doors. She fell asleep mid-sentence, book open on her chest. I stood there longer than necessary, watching her breathe, letting the quiet do its work. Months passed. Seasons shifted. We settled into the kind of rhythm that doesn't photograph well but sustains itself anyway. Sloane grew taller. Her laugh changed. I noticed the day she stopped flinching when a motorboat passed us on the road, the sound fading behind us without consequence. It felt like a milestone I hadn't known to track. Once at a school event, another parent asked me where my family was from. It was an innocent question, the kind people ask without thinking. I paused, then answered simply, "It's just us." She smiled. That must be nice. "It is," I said, surprised by how true it felt. There were moments when the old narratives tried to resurface through mutual acquaintances, through sideways comments about forgiveness and healing. I let them pass. Healing isn't a performance. Forgiveness isn't owed to people who would use it as leverage. I wasn't interested in reopening doors that had only ever led us back to danger. One afternoon, Sloane came home with a permission slip for a field trip involving boats. She set it on the counter and waited. I read it carefully. Safety measures, supervision, short duration. I looked up at her. "Do you want to go?" She thought for a moment. "Yes," she said. "But I want you to meet the teacher first." "Of course," I said. She went. She had fun. She came home tired and sun-flushed and full of stories that had nothing to do with fear. When she fell asleep that night, the permission slip was still on the counter, folded neatly. I didn't throw it away. I didn't keep it either. I recycled it. Ordinary paper, no longer carrying anything we needed to hold on to. That was when I understood what this phase really was. Not aftermath. Integration. The long, quiet work of letting truth settle into the body until it stops buzzing. I don't think about the people who tried to harm us very often anymore. When I do, it's without heat, without curiosity. They exist in a different register now, facts, not figures. history, not influence. What remains is simpler. A home that feels lived in. A child who trusts her footing. A life that doesn't need defending every time it's named. If survival has a sound, it isn't loud. It's the hum of something steady, uninterrupted, the kind you only notice when it's gone. Ours is still here. The last part didn't arrive with a headline or a verdict. It arrived quietly the way most endings do when they're real. One afternoon, I realized I hadn't checked the court portal in weeks. Not because I was avoiding it, because it hadn't crossed my mind. The systems that once felt omnipresent had receded into the background, still there, still functioning, but no longer demanding my attention. I took that as a sign. Sloan and I had settled into a life that didn't require explanation. Mornings were unremarkable in the best possible way, alarm breakfast backpacks by the door. Evenings had a rhythm now. Homework at the table, dishes together, a show or a book before bed. There were days that felt heavy, of course. Grief doesn't evaporate, it thins. But the weight no longer tipped us forward. It stayed where it belonged, integrated instead of overwhelming. The first time Sloan asked to go swimming again, it wasn't a test. It was casual. We were at a community pool, concrete, warm underfoot, and the smell of sunscreen and chlorine thick in the air. She stood at the edge, toes curled, watching the water ripple with laughter and movement. "Will you watch me?" she asked. "I'm not going anywhere," I said. She nodded and jumped in, resurfacing with a grin that startled something loose inside my chest. I sat there, arms folded on the railing, tracking her movements, not because I didn't trust the water, but because vigilance had become a habit I could now choose, not one imposed by fear. Later that night, after she fell asleep, I stood in the doorway of her room and let myself remember the ocean. Not the panic, not the helplessness, just the scale of it. The way it had revealed with brutal clarity what mattered and what never had. I didn't relive it. I acknowledged it the way you acknowledge a scar, evidence of survival, not a wound that still needs tending. I never heard from my sister again. No letter, no message routed through a third party. Silence in her case felt appropriate. It meant there was nothing left to extract, no leverage to apply. My parents sent one note months later. Short, apologetic in tone, careful in wording. They asked if there might ever be a way forward. I read it once, then folded it and placed it in a drawer I rarely opened. Not because I needed to keep it, but because I didn't need to respond. Forward isn't always together. Sometimes it's parallel at a distance that keeps everyone honest. Work stabilized. I took on fewer projects, but did them well. I stopped chasing volume. I chose consistency. The fridge light didn't glow at odd hours anymore. The spreadsheets balanced. The house filled with small markers of time art taped to the fridge, a height chart penciled onto a door frame, shoes abandoned near the entryway because they were worn every day. One evening, Sloan sat beside me on the couch, her legs tucked under her, her head resting against my shoulder. "Do you ever miss how it was before?" she asked. I knew what she meant. Before the ocean, before the courtrooms, before the lines were drawn. "Sometimes," I said, "but I don't miss being confused." She thought about that. "I like now," she said. "So do I." We didn't talk about the future in big terms. We didn't need to. Plans existed, of course, school years, trips we might take, the shape of seasons yet to come. But they were held lightly. The urgency was gone. We had learned what happens when you rush someone into a decision they're not ready to make. We moved at our own pace now. On the anniversary of the day we were found, I took Sloan out for ice cream. Not to market. Just because the weather was warm and she'd asked. We sat on a bench watching people pass the world, busy with lives that had nothing to do with ours. She got chocolate, I got vanilla. Ordinary choices freely made. As we walked back to the car, she slipped her hand into mine without looking up. It was an unconscious gesture, easy unguarded. Trust made visible in motion. I tightened my grip just enough for her to feel it and kept walking. I've been asked quietly, indirectly, why I tell this story at all. Why not let it recede completely? Why not close the chapter and move on without leaving a trace? The answer is simple. Because silence is only protective when it's chosen. Because there are people living inside situations that don't add up, being told their instincts are overreactions, their questions, inconveniences. Because danger doesn't always arrive shouting. Sometimes it arrives with paperwork and smiles and a cup of tea offered at the right moment. I don't share this to warn. Warnings assume you can predict outcomes. I share it to normalize attention, to remind people that noticing isn't paranoia, it's participation. It's the first act of self-respect. Sloane doesn't define herself by what happened to us. I don't either. But we carry the understanding forward quietly. We know now what it feels like to choose truth when it costs something. We know what protection actually requires. We know that love doesn't need leverage to survive. The ocean didn't take us. The courts didn't define us. What remains is not triumph, but something steadier. A life built with intention. A bond tested and held. A future that doesn't need to be defended in advance. Every night before I turn off the lights, I walk the house once. Not because I'm afraid. Because it reminds me where we are. It reminds me that this place exists, that it holds us, that we belong to it without conditions. When I close Sloane's door, I pause for a moment, listening to the soft rhythm of her breathing. Then I turn the handle and walk away, confident that nothing on the other side gets to decide who we are. We made it back. That's enough. There are stories that end with applause, with clear victories and raised voices. This isn't one of them. What stayed with me wasn't the courtroom or the ocean or even the fear. It was the quiet realization that survival doesn't always look like fighting back. Sometimes it looks like standing still long enough to see who keeps pushing and why. I learned that pain doesn't demand meaning. It doesn't need to be redeemed or explained away. It only asks to be acknowledged, then placed where it can no longer decide your future. Protecting someone you love isn't heroic. It's practical. It's showing up every day, making choices that won't look dramatic from the outside, but will matter deeply to the person depending on you. If there's anything I carry forward, it's this: clarity is a form of peace. Not because it erases what happened, but because it prevents it from happening again. If this story stirred something in you, if you've ever had to choose between keeping the peace and protecting what matters, I'd like to hear from you. Share your experience in the comments. Sometimes speaking it out loud is the first step toward setting it down. And if you found value in this story, please consider liking the video and subscribing. Thank you for listening and for being here.